Have you ever seen it happen? A totally friendly colleague gets a promotion, and suddenly they're like a different person, unrecognizable. Or maybe you've wondered why history is just packed with leaders who seem to get completely transformed by their authority. For centuries, we've wrestled with this huge question about human nature, and today we're going to dive deep into the psychology behind it all.
I mean, we all know the saying, right? Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. But is it really that simple? Is power some kind of toxic chemical that just seeps into us and changes our character for the worse? Or is there something, much more fascinating and maybe more revealing going on here? Today, we're going to peel back the layers on this big psychological mystery.
All right, so here's our game plan for today. We'll start with that ultimate question, then dive into a really shocking experiment. We'll look at the obedience mechanism behind it, explore how power can change people, and then we'll get to the final piece of the puzzle, the great unmasking. I think this last one's going to surprise you.
Okay, first up, the shocking experiment. To really get a handle on power, we first have to understand our own relationship to it. And honestly, there's no better place to start than with one of the most famous and, frankly, one of the most unsettling experiments ever done. So picture this. It's 1963, we're at Yale University. People are walking in for what they think is a simple study on memory and learning. They're getting paid about $4 an hour for their time. But what they don't know is that the real experiment was something else entirely. The whole setup was, well, pretty ingenious. You had three people involved. First, the experimenter, this guy in a lab coat who was the clear authority figure. Then you had the learner, who was secretly an actor. And finally, the teacher. Now, the teacher was the real subject of the study. They were the only person in the room who had no idea what was really going on. Their job? They had to give what they believed were real electric shocks to the learner every time they got an answer wrong. And these shocks escalated with every single mistake. At 150 volts, the actor in the other room starts screaming in pain. Then at 300 volts, and this is a really key moment, he just goes completely silent. No more answers, no more sounds, nothing. All the while, the voltage meter goes all the way up to a terrifying 450 volts. And any time the teacher showed any hesitation, the guy in the lab coat would just calmly but firmly tell them, "The experiment requires that you continue." Okay, so before the study even began, Milgram asked a group of 39 psychiatrists a question. He said, "What percentage of normal, everyday people do you think would go all the way to 450 volts? Even after hearing the screams and then the dead silence?" And their prediction? 0%. They thought absolutely nobody would do it. But the actual result was just horrifying. 65%. 65% of the participants went all the way and administered the maximum 450-volt shock. That's nearly 2/3 of regular people who, even though they were clearly in distress, sweating, trembling, some even had this nervous laughter, they still chose to obey the authority figure over their own conscience. So that brings us to the next big question, the obedience mechanism. That stunning result just begs the question, why? I mean, what kind of psychological switch gets flipped inside us that makes good people follow orders that seem so obviously terribly wrong? Well, this is where we start to uncover that mechanism. Milgram came up with a name for this. He called it the agentic state. And here's the key idea. It's when a person stops seeing themselves as an individual who's responsible for their own choices. Instead, they start to see themselves as just a tool, an instrument carrying out the wishes of someone else. They basically outsource their moral responsibility to the authority figure. And that creates this incredibly dangerous vacuum where terrible things can be justified with that all too familiar excuse, "I was just following orders."
So you gotta ask, what gave that experimenter so much influence? Well, he was using what we call position power. That white lab coat, the fact that he was at Yale, all of that gave him legitimate authority. This type of power, the kind that's based on your rank or your title, it's really good at forcing compliance. But it's a completely different beast from personal power. That's the kind you earn through respect and admiration, and it leads to people actually agreeing with you, not just obeying you.
All right, next up, when power changes people. So we've seen how people obey power, but what about the person who actually gets the power? What happens to them? Well, this brings us to something called the power transformation effect. And yeah, this might just explain why your friend who got a promotion suddenly started acting so differently. It turns out, researchers have pinpointed 5 ways that power can really start to corrode our character. First, it can make people more manipulative. They start seeing others as just pawns in their game. It can also boost their self-centeredness, making them feel like the rules don't apply to them. They start to inflate their own accomplishments while, at the same time, devaluing what others do. And finally, it creates this psychological distance where they literally start to see other people as beneath them.
And look, this isn't just a theory. A 1972 study by a researcher named David Kipnis gave us the cold, hard evidence. What he did was set up an experiment where college students got to act as bosses. They were given power to reward and punish a group of high school students who were their subordinates.
And the results? Well, they're pretty stark. The group of bosses who had actual power, they only gave high ratings to their subordinates 28% of the time. Now compare that to the control group, the bosses who had no real power. They gave out high ratings 78% of the time. Just having a little bit of power made them completely devalue the work of the people under them. It's wild.
Okay, so let's move on to our final section, the Great Unmasking. So at this point, the evidence seems pretty clear, right? People blindly obey authority, and getting power makes you a worse person. Case closed. Well, not so fast. This is where our story takes a really fascinating final turn. What if we've been asking the wrong question this whole time? What if power doesn't corrupt people? What if it reveals them?
So, a groundbreaking study back in 2001 completely reframed this whole debate. What it found is that power acts as a disinhibitor. Okay, what does that mean? Think of it this way. Most of us in our daily lives wear a kind of mask of social norms, right? We're polite, we cooperate because society expects us to. Power doesn't change who you are underneath the mask, it just gives you the freedom to finally take it off. It lets your true, unfiltered self come out.
Here's how they tested it. In this study, they figured out beforehand who was generally selfish and who was generally altruistic. Then, they gave them power and let them assign tasks. The results were just crystal clear. The people who were naturally selfish used their new power to take all the easy jobs for themselves. But the altruistic folks, they did the exact opposite. They used their power to take on the hardest tasks to make things easier for everyone else. See, power didn't change them at all. It just amplified who they already were deep down.
And this whole idea is summed up perfectly in this quote from Michelle Obama. Being president doesn't change who you are. It reveals who you are. It's so true. When all the pressure to fit in and play by the rules is suddenly gone because of your status, the only thing left to guide you is your true core character. So what's the big takeaway for leadership here? Well, it means that character is literally everything. A leader who is a giver deep down actually has a huge strategic advantage. See, most people in the world are what you'd call matchers. They basically treat you the way you treat them. So when a leader is a giver, they build trust. And that trust triggers this amazing chain reaction of reciprocity, loyalty, and effort from their entire team. It creates this virtuous cycle of success and psychological safety for everyone involved.
And that, in the end, brings the question right back to us, to you. Because power, whether it's in big ways or small ones, touches all of our lives at some point. It's not some external force that corrupts us. It's more like a mirror that shows us what's really on the inside. So the final question really isn't about power at all, is it? It's about you. When your mask comes off, who will you be?